Victor Hale didn't knock. He never knocked. Knocking implied that the person on the other side had some say in what happened next, and Victor Hale had stopped believing that about anyone in Blackridge a long time ago. He walked straight into the trading post, past the old counter, past the jars of dried goods and the smell of sawdust and axle grease, and stopped in front of the 7-year-old girl sitting on the floor in the corner with her knees pulled up to her chest. He looked down at her the way a man looks at something he's already decided to throw away. "You're still here," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't concern. It was the particular tone of a man who had given an order and was displeased that the order hadn't carried itself out on its own. Lily Carter looked up at him. She didn't say anything. She had learned very quickly that saying anything only made things worse. Victor crouched down to her level, not out of kindness, but to make sure she heard him clearly. His voice dropped low. "Your father isn't coming back. You understand that? He's gone. And the longer you sit here taking up space that doesn't belong to you, the harder this is going to be. For everybody." He paused. "Especially for you." Then he stood up, straightened his coat, and walked back out into the afternoon light like he'd just settled a minor piece of business. And Lily Carter, 7 years old, sat in that corner and didn't cry. She had already used up all her tears in the first 4 days. What was left wasn't grief anymore. It was something harder, something she didn't have a name for yet. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, against the thing hidden beneath her dress, and she waited. She was still waiting when a dusty man on a tired horse rode into Blackridge 12 days later. Well, if you've ever watched someone walk past a child in trouble and told yourself it wasn't your business, this story is going to stay with you. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because what Victor Hale did next is something nobody in that town ever forgot. Caleb Stone had not planned to stop in Blackridge. He hadn't planned much of anything in the past 3 years, which was, if he was being honest with himself, and he tried not to be most of the time, the whole problem. Planning required believing that the future was worth arranging, and Caleb had spent the better part of 37 months convincing himself, with considerable success, that it was not. He rode into town because his horse needed water, and he needed whiskey, and Blackridge had both, according to a sun-cracked sign on the trail that said so in faded letters. That was the full extent of his ambitions for the day. He noticed the girl before he noticed anything else. That surprised him later when he thought about it. The town had other things worth noticing. A row of storefronts, a livery stable, a saloon with a broken shutter, men moving with that particular hunched shoulder purpose that people develop when they're used to keeping their eyes forward. But the girl cut through all of it. Something about the stillness of her, the way she sat on those wooden steps outside what looked like a trading post, not fidgeting, not watching the street with the natural curiosity that children had, just sitting, containing herself, like a candle that had learned to burn very small to make sure it didn't go out. Caleb pulled up in front of the livery and climbed down from the saddle with the stiffness of a man who had been riding too long. He handed the reins to the stable boy, a freckled kid of maybe 12 who didn't look at him directly, and he stretched his back and looked around. The girl was still there. He looked away, walked to the trough, and washed his face and hands, looked back. Still there. He thought, not my business. He thought, I came here for water and whiskey. He walked toward the saloon. He got 12 feet before he stopped. He stood there for a moment, this gaunt man in a trail-worn coat with 3 days of stubble and eyes that had gone a little flat from disuse, and he had a very quiet argument with himself that he lost almost immediately. He turned around and walked toward the trading post. Up close, the girl was younger than he'd thought. 7, maybe? Small for her age, or maybe just worn down. It was sometimes hard to tell the difference. Her dress had been clean once. Her hair had been braided once. Both of those things had been a while ago. There was a smear of something on her left cheek that might have been dried food, or might have been dried tears, or both. Her hands were folded in her lap with a precision that looked practiced, like she'd decided that keeping her hands still was something she could control. She looked up when he stopped in front of her. He'd expected her to flinch. She didn't. She looked at him with eyes that were too steady for a child her age. The kind of steady that comes not from confidence, but from having already accepted that whatever was going to happen next was going to happen regardless. He crouched down so he wasn't looming over her. His knees protested. He ignored them. "Hey," he said. She didn't answer. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the last piece of dried jerky he'd been saving for the trail. He held it out. "You hungry?" She looked at the jerky. She looked at him. Some calculation happened behind those steady eyes. She took it. She ate it the way children ate when they were very hungry and were trying very hard not to look very hungry, in small, careful bites, chewing thoroughly, keeping her face neutral. She was not entirely successful. Caleb watched her and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time and didn't particularly want to feel now. "Tell me your name," he said. For a moment he thought she wasn't going to. Then quietly, like she was releasing something she'd been holding in closed fists, "Lily Carter." "I'm Caleb." She nodded, took another small bite of jerky. "How long have you been sitting here, Lily?" She thought about it with the seriousness of a child doing arithmetic. "Since Papa left," she said. "He said he'd come back. He said to wait." Caleb looked at the steps. The wood was worn in a pattern that suggested a small person had been sitting in the same spot long enough to leave a mark. He looked at the door of the trading post and saw, through the grimy window, a man behind the counter watching them with an expression somewhere between guilt and relief. The look of someone who had been hoping a problem would solve itself and was not entirely pleased that someone else had shown up to solve it instead. "When did your papa leave?" Caleb asked. Lily counted something silently. 17 days, she said. "I've been counting sunsets." 17 days. Caleb had raised animals long enough to know that a child who had survived 17 days alone on the steps of a trading post in a frontier town had done so because someone, or something, was feeding her just enough to keep her there, not out of kindness, out of intention. He stood up slowly, his eyes moving to the street. Men walked by. A woman in a gray dress crossed to the other side without looking at them. A man in a vest paused at the edge of his vision, watched for 2 seconds, then moved on. This wasn't neglect. Neglect was careless. This was deliberate. He looked down at Lily. "Your father," he said carefully, "did he say why he was leaving, where he was going?" Something crossed her face, a small tightening, like she'd caught herself almost saying something she'd decided not to say. "To talk to some men," she said. "About the land." "What land?" She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. The gesture was subtle, almost unconscious. But Caleb had spent enough years watching people carry things they didn't want others to see. She was carrying something, literally. He filed that away and didn't push it. "Are you cold at night?" "Sometimes." "Where do you sleep?" She glanced at the trading post door. "Mr. Baines lets me sleep inside when it gets real cold, but he said—" She stopped. "What did he say?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "He said I shouldn't talk to strangers." "That's generally good advice," Caleb said. "How's that working out for you so far?" Something flickered in her face. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of a memory of one. He turned and walked to the trading post door and pushed it open. The man behind the counter, Baines, apparently, was in his 50s, thick through the middle, with the look of a man who had once had a spine and had since traded it for something more convenient. He watched Caleb come in with the carefully neutral expression of a person who has prepared several different lies and is waiting to see which one the situation requires. "That girl outside," Caleb said. He didn't raise his voice. He had found, over the years, that you rarely needed to. "How long has she been there?" "She's not my responsibility," Baines said immediately. The speed of it was interesting. "I didn't ask whose responsibility she was. I asked how long." Baines wiped the counter with a rag that wasn't making it any cleaner. "Couple weeks, maybe. Her father worked out at the Hale Ranch. Had some kind of accident." "What kind of accident?" "The fatal kind." Baines said it flatly, without apology. "Look, I'm sorry about the child, but this isn't my—" "Did anybody tell her?" Baines stopped wiping the counter. "Did anybody—" Caleb said again. very quietly. Tell that little girl that her father is dead. The silence that followed was the worst kind, the kind where the answer was obvious, and everybody in the room knew it, and nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Baines looked at the counter. Victor Hale said to let things settle before Victor Hale. Caleb tasted the name. Who is Victor Hale? He owns the Hale Ranch, owns most of the land east of the creek, owns... Baines caught himself. He's a prominent man in this county. And he told you not to tell a 7-year-old that her father was dead. He said to let him handle it. He said there were legal matters, land matters. Baines finally looked up. There was something in his face that might have been shame if it hadn't been so thoroughly buried under years of looking the other way. Look, mister, I don't know who you are, but you'd do well to understand that some things in this town are bigger than you or me. What's her father's name? Thomas Carter. What happened to him? Fell off a horse. That's what Hale's men said. And his daughter has been sitting on your steps for 17 days. I gave her food. Baines said it defensively. I'm not a monster. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. Just a man who decided that being convenient was easier than being decent. He turned toward the door. Where are you going? Baines called after him. To talk to a little girl about her father. He walked back outside. Lily was still there, sitting in the same exact position, hands folded, watching the street with those 2 old eyes. She looked up when he came back. Caleb crouched down again. His knees hated him again. He sat with that for a moment. The discomfort, the weight of what he was about to do. And then he said carefully, Lily, when did you last see your papa? 17 days ago, I told you. And in 17 days, has anyone, Mr. Baines or anyone else in this town, said anything to you about your papa? About why he hasn't come back yet? She watched him. Something shifted in those eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like a wall that had been holding something back for a very long time and could feel pressure on the other side of it. No, she said, but her voice had gone thinner. Caleb had done this before, not often. He had told a woman her husband wasn't coming home. He had told a rancher that his son had been found in a riverbed. Each time, there was a moment right before the words left your mouth where you could still go back, still say something else, still preserve the version of the world where the worst hadn't happened yet. He never went back. He'd always felt that the kindest thing you could do for someone was not make them keep carrying a hope that wasn't going anywhere. Your papa loved you very much, he said. I can see that. He made sure you'd be safe. He made arrangements for you. Lily was very still. He had an accident, Lily, a bad one. Caleb kept his voice steady and low. He didn't make it. For 3 seconds, she didn't move at all. Then her chin dropped to her chest. She didn't cry loudly, no heaving, no dramatic collapse, just a single, shuddering breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. And then her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to become smaller than she already was, and her folded hands tightened against each other until her knuckles went white. Caleb didn't say anything. He didn't reach out and touch her, because she didn't know him, and he didn't want to make things worse by adding a stranger's hands to a moment like this. He just stayed where he was, crouched down to her level, close enough that she wasn't alone, but not so close that she couldn't breathe. After a while, a long while, she lifted her head. Her eyes were wet. Her face was red and uneven. She looked like a child now, fully, for the first time since he'd seen her. All that terrible steadiness dissolved into something raw and honest and very, very young. He's not coming back, she said. Not a question. No. She nodded. A small, terrible nod. He told me to wait, she said. He said... Her voice broke and she steadied it with visible effort. He said if anything happened, I should wait and not talk to anybody and not let anybody take it. Her hand pressed flat against her stomach again. He said it was important. He said people would want it and I shouldn't give it to them. Caleb looked at her hand, at the way it sat against her midsection. What did he give you, Lily? She looked at him for a long time, evaluating. He held still under the weight of it. He said I could trust a good man, she said finally. He said I'd know one when I saw one. And do you know one now? She looked at him with those eyes that had seen 17 days of people walking past her without stopping. 17 days of a grown man behind a counter telling her without words that her existence was inconvenient. 17 days of holding herself together on a hard wooden step in a town that had collectively decided not to see her. Maybe, she said. She reached into the collar of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges from being held and refolded many times. She held it out to him. He took it carefully and unfolded it. It was a land deed. Handwritten, dated 6 weeks ago, witnessed and notarized in a county seat 40 miles north. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the penmanship of a man who hadn't written much but wanted to make sure this particular thing was written right. The land described was a valley, acreage, boundary markers, creek access, a spring. The name on the deed was Lily Margaret Carter. Not Thomas Carter, not any man, a 7-year-old girl. Caleb read it twice. Then he folded it back along its worn creases and held it out to Lily, who tucked it back against her skin with the practiced efficiency of a child who had been guarding a secret for weeks. He stood up. His knees were beyond complaint at this point. He looked out at the street, at the people moving through it, the men who looked away from him, the woman who had crossed to the other side, the man in the vest who was no longer visible but whom Caleb had the distinct feeling was not entirely gone. Thomas Carter hadn't just had an accident. Thomas Carter had put his land in his daughter's name, and then Thomas Carter had died, and then a man named Victor Hale had arranged for nobody to tell the girl, and now there was a 7-year-old child sitting on a trading post step in a town full of people who had all decided, one by one, that it was easier to look away. And the girl was still holding the deed, which meant Victor Hale didn't have it yet, which meant whatever he'd planned, whatever arrangement he'd assumed would quietly settle itself, hadn't settled. Caleb thought about his horse. He thought about the whiskey he hadn't had yet. He thought about the road out of Blackridge, which was right where he'd left it, and would take him north or south or east or west. His choice, no obligations. He thought about a man named Thomas Carter who had written his daughter's name on a piece of paper and told her to trust a good man, and then died hoping she would. He looked down at Lily. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Not just jerky hungry, actually hungry. She looked up at him. "Yes." "All right." He held out his hand. "Come on." She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. Then she uncurled herself from the steps, slowly, stiffly, like a person who had been sitting in the same position for much too long, and she put her small hand in his. Her hand was cold. He noticed that, and very thin. They walked down the street together, and Caleb felt the eyes on them from every doorway and window. That particular quality of attention that a town gave when something was happening that everyone had an opinion about and no one intended to do anything about. He found a small restaurant attached to the back of a boarding house and pushed the door open and steered Lily to a table in the corner, the one with a wall at her back, which was the same table he always chose and which he'd started doing years ago for reasons that had since become habit rather than fear. The woman who came to take their order was somewhere in her 60s, with gray hair pinned up and an expression that managed to be both wary and decent at the same time. She looked at Lily and something moved across her face. "Bring her whatever you have that's hot," Caleb said, "and bring it fast." The woman went without argument. While they waited, Caleb watched Lily look at the table in the room and then at her own hands. And he watched her recalibrate. Watched her absorb the fact of her father's death in the way children absorbed impossible things, not all at once, but in layers, each layer sitting on top of the last until the total weight of it became something she'd have to carry forward. She was doing this quietly, which was worse in some ways than if she'd been loud about it. "He was teaching me to ride," she said without looking up. Caleb didn't say anything. "He said by spring I'd be good enough to go all the way to the valley on my own." She turned her water glass in small increments, watching it. "He said the spring was the best part. He said in the morning the light comes through the trees and makes it look like the whole world is made of gold." Caleb sat with that. "He sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was." She said it simply, without ornament. "He wasn't perfect. He got mad sometimes. He burned the beans a lot." A pause. He couldn't whistle no matter how hard he tried. Caleb almost smiled. What did he do instead? He hummed, real bad, off key. She finally looked up, but I liked it anyway. The food came, a bowl of stew, thick and steaming, with bread on the side. Lily looked at it like she wasn't sure it was real. Eat, Caleb said. She ate. Not carefully this time. The hunger she'd been managing for 17 days caught up with her the moment she stopped managing it, and she ate with the focused intensity of a child who had been very, very hungry and was now, finally, allowed to admit it. Caleb drank his coffee and watched the door and thought. Victor Hale had let a child sit on those steps for 17 days. Not because he forgot about her, not because he was careless, because she was an obstacle, a small, inconvenient 7-year-old obstacle, and his solution had been to let time and weather and loneliness do his work for him. Break her down until she was desperate enough to accept whatever arrangement he offered, or wait until she was removed by other means, or simply wait until someone in the county decided to step in legally, at which point he'd already arranged to be the legal solution. Clean hands, that was what powerful men always wanted. The dirty work happened at a distance, and they walked in afterward with the paperwork already written. Thomas Carter had understood that. That was why he'd put the deed in Lily's name instead of holding it himself. He'd known that if anything happened to him, a piece of land with a man's name on it could be contested, redrawn, purchased under pressure. But a 7-year-old girl's inheritance, officially notarized, properly witnessed, was a different kind of legal problem. Victor Hale couldn't just take it. He had to make her give it, and she hadn't given it. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. He did not want this problem. He wanted to be clear with himself about that. He was a man with no home, no family, no particular future he was building toward, and 3 years of practiced indifference to things that were not his business. He was 39 years old, and he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the road. He was very specifically not the kind of man who should be making promises to children. He set the coffee cup down and looked at Lily, who was mopping the last of the stew with her bread with the earnest thoroughness of a child who had been raised to not waste food. She looked up and caught him watching. Something cautious came into her face, the automatic wariness of a person who had learned that being watched usually meant something was about to be taken away. "You gonna leave?" she asked. She said it with the flatness of someone asking a question they already knew the answer to. "Not tonight," he said. It wasn't a promise. He was careful about that, but it was something. She nodded and went back to her bread. Outside, through the small window of the boarding house restaurant, Caleb could see the street, and on the far side of it, leaning against a post with the particular studied casualness of a man who was being paid to look casual, was someone watching them. Not the man in the vest from before, a different man, younger and less practiced at making himself invisible. Caleb watched him for a moment, then looked away. Victor Hale already knew about him. That was fine. Caleb had spent 3 years disappearing into roads and trail camps in frontier towns where nobody knew his name. He knew how to be invisible too. But somewhere between the steps of that trading post and this table and a bowl of stew and a little girl who hummed off key because her father had taught her to, somewhere in there, something had shifted. He didn't have a name for it yet. Didn't try to. He just knew that when Lily finally pushed back her empty bowl and looked at him with her red-rimmed eyes and her worn-down face and her hand pressed flat against her stomach over the paper that her father had died protecting, he felt the particular discomfort of a man who has accidentally stumbled back into caring about something. And he didn't walk away from the table. He ordered her a second bowl of stew. Later, after she had eaten and he had found her a room in the boarding house with a lock on the door, a lock he paid the landlady extra to take seriously, and after she had fallen asleep on a real bed for the first time in 17 days, Caleb sat in the chair by the window and unfolded the copy of the deed he'd made from memory while she slept. He didn't have the paper. She kept it. But he'd read it carefully enough to reconstruct the key points: the land description, the acreage, the spring, the witnesses' names. The spring was the thing. Everything east of Black Ridge was drought-prone in summer. He'd heard enough trail talk to know that. A guaranteed water source in that kind of country wasn't just valuable. It was the thing everything else depended on. Ranchers, farmers, The town itself, eventually. Whoever controlled the spring controlled the future of the whole region. Thomas Carter had known that. He'd carved out that valley and filed his claim properly and put it in his daughter's name because he was a man who understood that the powerful took what they wanted from the weak, and the only defense was paperwork done right in front of witnesses. And then he died. And now his 7-year-old daughter was asleep in the next room with a land deed hidden against her skin, in a town where the most powerful man in the county had spent 17 days engineering the circumstances to take it from her. Caleb refolded his notes and looked out the window at the dark street. A town full of people who had looked away. A girl who had kept waiting anyway. A man who had spent 3 years running and had just, in the space of one afternoon, stopped. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and breathed. He was going to need to be very careful. Victor Hale hadn't gotten where he was by being stupid, and men who weren't stupid and had money and influence and hired hands didn't respond well to obstruction. The next move had to be thought through. Who to talk to? What records to look for? Who in this town still had enough spine left to matter when the time came? And the time was coming. He could feel it. He'd been in enough situations to know when the ground was already moving under his feet, even when everything on the surface looked still. He sat in that chair until the early hours, not sleeping, just thinking. The careful, patient thinking of a man who had decided something without quite realizing he'd decided it, and was now working backward to figure out what exactly it was going to cost him. In the next room, Lily Carter slept. For the first time in 17 days, she had eaten enough. For the first time in 17 days, there was a locked door between her and the rest of the world. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Caleb was already awake when the knock came at his door. Not because he'd slept light, he hadn't slept at all. He'd sat in that chair by the window, watching the street go dark and then go quiet, and then start to gray at the edges with early morning, turning things over in his mind the way you turned a stone to see what lived under it. By the time the knock came, soft, hesitant, 3 taps, the sky outside was the color of old pewter, and the town below was still holding itself in that particular pre-dawn silence where even the dogs hadn't started yet. He crossed to the door and opened it. Lily stood in the hallway in her dress, her hair loose and tangled from sleep, holding her shoes in one hand. She looked up at him with the expression of a child who has woken in an unfamiliar place and spent the first disorienting seconds of consciousness working out whether or not she was safe. She had apparently concluded that the hallway outside his door was the safest available option. "Bad dream?" he asked. She shook her head, then reconsidered. "I don't know. Maybe." She paused. "I kept thinking someone was coming in." Caleb stepped back from the door and let her in. She came in without ceremony and sat in the chair he'd been sitting in all night, pulling her knees up to her chest, and looked out the window at the gray street below. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her. "You want to talk about it?" "No." "All right." They sat in silence for a while, which was something Caleb had always been better at than most people, sitting in silence without feeling the need to fill it. Lily apparently had also developed this particular skill over 17 days on a set of wooden steps. They were, he thought wryly, well matched in at least that regard. After a while she said without turning from the window, "What are you going to do?" "About what?" She gave him a look that suggested she found the question slightly insulting. "About Hale," she said. He studied her, 7 years old. "You know his name." "My father said it when he was talking to himself." She turned back to the window. "Papa used to talk to himself when he was worried. He tried to be quiet about it, but I could hear him through the wall." A pause. "He said Victor Hale wanted our land. He said Hale had been wanting it for years. He said—" She stopped. "What?" She was quiet for a moment. "He said he was going to make sure Hale never got it, no matter what." She said the last 3 words very carefully, like she was reading them off something written in her memory. "And then he went to talk to some men about it, and he didn't come back." Caleb let that sit. "Did your father say who the men were, the ones he was going to talk to?" "No. He just said he was going to make it official. That's what he said. Official." She turned the word over like she was still trying to understand it. "He said there were witnesses, 2 of them. He said once it was official, Hale couldn't touch it." The deed. Witnessed, notarized. Thomas Carter had known exactly what he was doing. He'd gone and made it official, and then he'd come home and put it in his daughter's keeping and told her to trust a good man, and then he'd gone to have a conversation with somebody and he'd fallen off a horse. Caleb thought about the word accident, about the way Baines had said it, the fatal kind, flat and quick, like the man saying something he'd practiced not thinking about. "All right," Caleb said. "Here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to ask some questions. Talk to some people." He kept his voice even. "You're going to stay here, in this room, with the door locked. The landlady downstairs, Mrs. Holt. She's going to bring you breakfast. You don't open this door for anyone else. Not Baines, not anyone who says they work for Hale, not anyone you don't know." Lily nodded. She seemed unsurprised by the instruction, which bothered him more than if she'd pushed back. "And the deed," he said. "Keep it where it is." She pressed her hand against her stomach. "I know." "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." She almost did the not quite smile again. He was starting to recognize it, that small flicker at the corner of her mouth that appeared and disappeared so fast you could convince yourself you'd imagined it. He left her with breakfast arriving and Mrs. Holt, a stout, sensible woman from Ohio who had been running this boarding house for 11 years and who, when Caleb explained the situation in brief and direct terms, had looked at him with the focused seriousness of someone who had raised children and understood what it meant when a grown man asked her to please take this seriously. He left Lily in Mrs. Holt's capable and quietly furious hands and went out into the morning. His first stop was the sheriff's office. The sheriff of Blackridge was a man named Dale Pruitt, and Caleb knew within 90 seconds of meeting him that Pruitt was not a bad man so much as a very tired one. He was somewhere in his late 50s, heavy-set, with a beard that had given up trying to have a definite shape and eyes that carried the look of someone who had been making compromises for so long that the compromises had started to feel like principles. He was also, Caleb noticed, careful. Not with his words, those he chose with the deliberate slowness of a man who had learned to take his time, but with his body. The way he sat behind his desk, the way he positioned himself so that his back was to the wall and the door was in his sightline. A careful man in a town run by someone who made people afraid was either a coward or a man who was waiting for a reason. Caleb hadn't decided which yet. "Thomas Carter," Caleb said. "Tell me about his accident." Pruitt's hands, which had been folded on the desk, very slightly tightened. "It was handled. County ruled it an accident." "I didn't ask what the county ruled. I asked you to tell me about it." Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. "You just rode in yesterday." "That's right." "And you're already asking about Thomas Carter." "His daughter's been sitting on Baines' steps for 17 days, Caleb said. "Nobody told her. I'm asking about her father." Something moved across Pruitt's face, there and gone, like a cloud shadow. He looked at his desk. He looked at the door. He looked back at Caleb. "He was found at the bottom of a ravine," Pruitt said. 12 miles east of town. Horse came back without him. We found him 2 days later." "Who found him?" "2 of Hale's ranch hands." "Convenient. It's Hale's land." "What was Thomas Carter doing on Hale's land?" Pruitt's jaw moved. "I don't know." "Yes, you do," Caleb said. Not unkindly, just flat and direct. The silence that followed was a long one. Pruitt's fingers moved against the desk surface, an unconscious pattern, like someone counting. "Carter had filed a complaint," Pruitt said finally. "Couple months back. Said Hale's men were diverting the creek upstream, reducing the flow through his valley. His spring was starting to dry up at the edges." He paused. "He came in here twice about it, wanted me to go out there with him and look at it." "And did you?" Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Hale's a county commissioner," he said. "He's on the board that approves my salary. He's on the board that approves everything in this county." He stopped. "And?" Caleb said. "And I told Carter I'd look into it." "But you didn't." The silence this time was different, thicker. "No," Pruitt said. "I didn't." Caleb stood up. He put his hat on. He looked at Pruitt for a moment. at this careful, tired man who had chosen the path of least resistance and had been living with that choice long enough that it had started to change the shape of his face. "Carter filed the complaint in writing?" Caleb asked. "Yes." "Where's that paper?" "In the files, third drawer." Pruitt said it automatically, then caught himself, like he hadn't meant to say it quite that fast. Caleb waited. Pruitt opened the drawer. The next stop was the county land office, which was attached to the back of the general store and staffed by a man named Elias Grubb, who had the cheerful, harried look of someone who genuinely loved paperwork and was perpetually behind on it. Grubb was young, mid-20s, glasses, ink on his fingers, and appeared to be constitutionally incapable of being anything other than literal. "Carter Land Grant," Caleb said, "Valley Parcel, spring-fed. Filed approximately 8 to 10 months ago." Grubb found it in 4 minutes, which was actually impressive. He spread it on the counter and stood back while Caleb read it. The original filing was Thomas Carter's. Properly done, properly bounded, properly registered, dated 11 months ago. But there was something else in the file. A second document, filed 6 weeks ago, 2 weeks before Thomas Carter's death. A petition. Counterclaim of prior rights signed by Victor Hale, arguing that his family had used the spring as a water source for their ranch operations for over a decade before Carter's claim, and that Carter's deed represented an enclosure of established common resource. Caleb read it twice. "Who notarized this?" Grubb looked at the document. "Chester Meade. He's a notary in Calhoun County. 40 miles north." "That's right." "Same place Thomas Carter filed his deed." Grubb blinked. Yes, same notary." Caleb looked at the petition again. The witnesses listed were 2 men whose names he didn't recognize. He copied them down. He also copied the date, 6 weeks ago. Thomas Carter had filed the deed in Lily's name 6 weeks ago. Victor Hale had filed a counterclaim 6 weeks ago. Thomas Carter had died 5 weeks ago. The timeline fit together in a way that made Caleb's stomach go flat and hard. "Is Hale's counterclaim active?" he asked. "It's filed," Grubb said carefully. "A judge would have to rule on it, but with no opposing party making a claim." He stopped, adjusted his glasses. "Carter's heir would need to make a formal appearance, assert the claim. Without that, Hale's petition could be granted by default." "How long before it goes to default?" Grubb looked at the document. 60 days from filing." He did quick arithmetic. "About 2.5 weeks from now." To 2.5 weeks. Victor Hale hadn't needed to steal the deed. He'd never intended to steal it. He'd planned to wait, let the 60 days run out. Let the little girl sit on those steps, frightened, alone, not knowing her father was dead, not knowing about the deed, not knowing about any of it, and let the clock run down until the default judgment handed him everything he wanted with the full blessing of the legal system. Clean hands. Caleb walked back out into the morning street and stood for a moment, hat in hand, looking at nothing in particular. He had 2.5 weeks. He had a dead man's complaint and a child's land deed and a sheriff who was tired enough to maybe be pushed toward doing the right thing if someone pushed right. He also had, he noticed, 2 men watching him from across the street, different men from the one last night. These 2 were older, less interested in looking casual, and one of them was chewing tobacco with the practiced boredom of someone who had been paid to stand somewhere and look unpleasant and was good at their job. Hale's men. Obviously. Caleb put his hat back on and walked in the opposite direction. He found the woman on his third pass through the side streets of Black Ridge. He hadn't known he was looking for her specifically. He'd been looking for anyone who might have known Thomas Carter, anyone who might have something to say that wasn't filtered through fear of Victor Hale. What he'd found instead was a woman hanging laundry in the narrow yard behind a small house on the edge of town, moving with the efficient, unhurried speed of someone who had learned to get everything done before the day got away from them. She was maybe 45, with strong hands and a face that had spent a lot of time in wind and sun, and she looked at him over a bedsheet with the particular assessment of a woman who had learned to evaluate strangers quickly. "You're the man who's staying at Holt's place," she said, "with the Carter girl." News moved fast in small towns. It always did. "That's right. You're asking around about Thomas." "I am." She pinned the sheet, picked up another.
My name's Ruth Alderman. My husband worked the same parcel as Thomas, 2 seasons back. They were friendly. She didn't look at him while she said this. Thomas came to supper a few times. Lily, too, when she was with him. Caleb waited. He was worried, Ruth said. Last time I saw him, month before he died, he came by to tell Walt that he'd done something. Made arrangements, he called it. He was glad about it. Said he'd finally done what he should have done 2 years ago. She paused. Walt asked him if he was being careful. Thomas said he was being more than careful. He said he was being smart. Did he say anything about Hale? About what Hale knew? He said Hale would find out soon enough, and it wouldn't matter. Ruth's hands stopped moving for just a second. Those were his exact words. It won't matter. He was... She shook her head. He was almost cheerful about it, which scared me, if I'm honest, because men who are cheerful about something that ought to scare them are usually wrong about why it won't matter. Caleb thought about the counterclaim, filed the same week as the deed. Hale found out fast. Hale has people everywhere, the notary's office, the land records, anywhere that matters. Ruth finally looked at him directly. Thomas was smart. He just didn't understand how many eyes Hale had.
Did your husband see the accident report? The official one? Ruth's expression shifted. Something careful came into it. Walt went to look at the ravine, she said. 2 weeks after. He said, and he only said this to me, you understand, not to anyone official. He said there weren't the kind of marks you'd expect. If a horse threw a man over the edge. He said... She stopped, pressed her lips together. What did he say? He said the ground at the top of the ravine looked disturbed in a way that didn't match the story. She turned back to the laundry. Walt's a careful man. He didn't say it was anything. He just said it didn't look right. Caleb stood with that for a moment. Is Walt here? Walt is in Calhoun County right now working a drive. Back in 10 days. She pulled a shirt from the basket with more force than necessary. I'll tell you what I told him when he came home from that ravine. I said, Thomas is gone and knowing what happened to him won't bring him back. And whatever you're thinking about doing, you'd better weigh it against what Lily needs, which is to be alive and have her land and not be an orphan who lost the one man who was trying to help her. She looked at him again. This time, the look was direct and deliberate. That's what I'd say to you too, mister. Whatever you're building toward, weigh it right. Caleb nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Alderman. Don't thank me. Just don't get that child hurt. He walked back toward the boarding house by a different route, because the 2 men across the street were still there, and he had no interest in making their day easier. He was halfway down an alley between the smithy and a feed store when a man stepped out of a doorway in front of him. Not one of the 2 watchers from across the street. This one was different. Well-dressed for Blackridge, boots that cost money, a coat that fit properly. He was about 50, lean, with silver at his temples, and the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and now settled for commanding. Victor Hale, Caleb assumed, did not do his own watching. This man was something in between. Management, maybe. Someone trusted enough to speak. Mr. Stone, the man said. Caleb stopped. He didn't say anything. My name is Aldous Greer. I represent Mr. Victor Hale's interests in this county. He said it with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had introduced himself this way many times. I wonder if we might have a brief conversation. We're having one, Caleb said. Greer smiled with the particular warmth of a man who used warmth as a tool. Mr. Hale is aware that you've taken an interest in the Carter child. He thinks that's admirable, truly. A man riding through, seeing a child in need, there's something to be said for that. He paused, letting the compliment sit, watching to see if it landed. Caleb watched him back. The situation, Greer continued, is more complicated than it appears. There are legal matters surrounding the Carter property that are already in process. Mr. Hale has been quietly ensuring that the child will be properly placed. He's been in contact with a family in the next county who are interested in providing a home. A family he picked out, Caleb said. A reputable family, on terms he arranged. Greer's smile didn't flicker, but something behind it did. Mr. Hale is a generous man who wants what's best for the child. And what's best for the child happens to be an arrangement that removes her from any claim to her father's land. The smile stayed. The warmth behind it receded a few degrees. As I said, there are legal complexities. There's a deed, Caleb said, properly filed, witnessed, notarized, in the child's name. Something changed in Greer's face, just slightly. A recalibration, the kind that happened when a man realized the other man knew more than he'd expected. There may be documentation that predates 6 weeks ago, same week as the deed. I've seen it. Caleb took a step forward. Greer, to his credit, didn't step back. 2.5 weeks before it defaults. That's the math you're working with. Greer was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he said, in a different tone, less warmth, more weight, Mr. Stone, you're a man without roots in this county, without family here, without property or standing. He let that sit. You have no legal claim to the girl. You have no legal standing in the land matter. You rode in yesterday on a tired horse. Whatever you're imagining here, it won't end well for you. Maybe not, Caleb said, but I've made worse bets. He walked past Greer, close enough that Greer had to shift to let him by. He didn't look back. He went straight to the boarding house and knocked on the door of Lily's room in the pattern he'd told Mrs. Holt to establish. 3 knocks, then 2. And the lock turned. Lily opened the door. She looked at his face, and whatever she saw there made her step back and let him in without saying anything. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, organizing things. Then he looked up at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, even if you think it's the wrong answer. She nodded. The 2 witnesses on your father's deed. Did he mention their names to you? Did you ever hear him talk about who they were? She thought about it carefully, not rushing, not filling the space. He appreciated that about her. She didn't talk just to cover silence. There was a man named Garrett, she said. Papa called him Garrett. He came to the house once. They talked on the porch for a long time. She paused. And there was a woman. I don't know her name. Papa just called her the notary's clerk. The notary in Calhoun County? I think so. Caleb nodded. He hadn't had a name for the second witness in the copied file. It had been partially obscured, but a notary's clerk in Calhoun County was findable, and a man named Garrett was a start. Lily, he said, Victor Hale is going to try to make this look simple. He's going to try to make it look like the legal thing and the right thing are the same thing. They're not. He paused. Your father made sure of that. He did everything right. But the only way it holds is if we can stand in front of a judge and show them the whole truth, not the version Hale bought. She was sitting in the chair again, knees up, watching him. Is that what you're going to do? That's what I'm going to try to do. Why? He looked at her. Because your father put your name on that deed for a reason. Because he sat somewhere and wrote your name out carefully and made it official because he loved you and he wanted you to have something real, and I don't think I can let that just disappear. He stopped. And because somebody should have stopped walking past you a long time ago. Lily looked at him for a long time after that. Then she said, the man named Garrett. He gave Papa something before he left. An envelope. Papa put it in the tin box under the floorboard. Caleb went very still. What tin box? At home. She said it simply. Under the floor in the kitchen. Papa kept important things in it. He thought I didn't know, but I saw him once. A pause. He never said anything about it. He probably thought I'd forget. He underestimated you. For the first time, the actual first time, real and unambiguous, Lily Carter smiled. It was small and brief and crooked and completely genuine, and it changed the whole landscape of her face for just a second before it faded back. The house, Caleb said. How far from town? About 2 miles east, on the road to the valley. 2 miles east, on Hale's side of the creek. If Hale's men were watching the town, they were watching the roads out of it. The house would not be unmonitored. Getting there unseen would require going around, taking the long way, possibly at night. He thought about 2.5 weeks. He thought about Greer's carefully calibrated threat. He thought about a tin box under a kitchen floorboard with an envelope inside it. All right, he said. Tonight, after dark. He looked at her. Can you move quiet? She gave him the look again, the slightly insulted one. I survived 17 days on that step, she said. I can move quiet. He almost smiled. almost. "Get some sleep," he said. "Both of us need it." He stood up and moved toward the connecting door to his room. "And Lily." She looked up. "You did right," he said, holding on to it, all of it. "You did exactly what your father asked." She looked at the window. Her jaw worked slightly. She nodded once. He went into his room and lay down on top of the covers with his boots on and looked at the ceiling. 2.5 weeks. A tin box. A man named Garrett. A notary's clerk 40 miles away. A sheriff who might be salvageable. A town full of people who had chosen to look away but who still had to live with themselves. Outside, the 2 men across the street were probably still there. Caleb closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he slept without trying. They left at 2 in the morning, not because 2 in the morning was a particularly good time to do anything, but because it was the hour when the men Hale had watching the street were at their least attentive. Caleb had spent the evening tracking their rotation from his window, cataloging the points where their attention drifted, where they shifted weight and looked at their boots instead of the road. Men got paid to watch. They didn't get paid to care. After enough hours, there was a difference, and 2 in the morning was when that difference was widest. He woke Lily with a hand on her shoulder, and she came awake fast and quiet, which told him something about how she'd been sleeping for the past several weeks. Not deeply, not safely, but with one part of herself always listening. She was dressed and had her shoes on in under 2 minutes. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at him and waited. They went out through the back of the boarding house, through Mrs. Holt's kitchen, where a lamp had been left burning low on the table, and a paper on the counter said simply, "Door latches from outside, be careful." Caleb had told Mrs. Holt enough to earn that. He hadn't told her everything, because everything was the kind of thing that put people in difficult positions, and Mrs. Holt had a business to run in a town where Hale's shadow fell across most of it. The night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that had a presence to it, something physical pressing against the skin. The moon was 3/4 full, which was more light than Caleb wanted, but couldn't do anything about. They moved along the back edge of the property line, through the narrow gap between the feed store and the cooper's shed, and then south and east along a dry creek bed that took them away from the main road. Lily was quiet and steady beside him. She knew this ground better than he did, which became apparent when she touched his arm once and steered him around a patch of loose shale without saying a word. He let her lead after that, following her through the dark with the particular trust of a man who has decided that the person beside him knows something he doesn't. They reached the Carter property in just over an hour. It was a small house. Caleb had known that from context. A single man's claim, a valley parcel, modest by any standard, but seeing it still adjusted something in him. The house was maybe 3 rooms, well built actually, better than you'd expect. The kind of construction that came from a man who did things right, not because someone was watching, but because he knew the difference. A covered porch. A small barn off to the side. A kitchen garden gone to seed now, overgrown and ragged, the way things went when nobody was tending them. No lights anywhere. No horses tied outside. Either Hale's men hadn't thought to post someone here, or they'd been here already and left. The second possibility bothered him more than the first. He held Lily back at the edge of the tree line for 5 minutes, watching. Nothing moved. No light changed. No sound that didn't belong to the wind and whatever small animals were moving through the brush at the edge of the property. "Anybody been here since your father died?" he asked quietly. Lily looked at the house for a moment. "I don't know. I wasn't here," she paused. "I was on the steps." Right. 17 days. She'd been in town 17 days, which meant this house had been sitting here unmaintained, unlocked probably, accessible to anyone who knew about it. He didn't say that. "Stay close," he said instead, and they crossed the open ground quickly and made the porch without incident. The front door was not locked, which told him what he needed to know about whether someone had been here before them. Thomas Carter was the kind of man who built a solid porch and a straight-cornered house and did things right. He was also the kind of man who locked his door. The latch was not broken. It had simply been left open, and the edge of the door frame had a mark on it that Caleb crouched to examine by feel in the low moonlight coming through the front window. Something had been used to work the latch. Something thin. Someone who knew what they were doing, or who at least had patience. He stood up and pushed the door open the rest of the way, and they went inside. The house had been searched, not ransacked. That was the first thing he noticed, and it mattered. This wasn't someone who came in angry or in a hurry. The furniture was mostly in its original position. The shelves hadn't been swept. But the things on those shelves were subtly wrong, pushed back at odd angles, gaps where objects had been lifted and set down not quite in the same spot. The drawers of the small chest near the door had been gone through and closed again, but the bottom one was a half-inch proud of the frame in the way drawers got when they'd been opened and shut fast by someone who wasn't used to the particular warped fit of this specific piece of furniture. Someone had been here. Someone thorough and quiet. The question was whether they'd found what they were looking for. He looked at Lily. She was standing in the middle of the main room looking at the house with an expression he couldn't fully read in the dim light. Something between grief and the suppressed form of grief that came out as a very careful stillness. This was her home. The chairs and the chest and the smell of it, cold wood and dried herbs and something underneath that was just the particular smell of the life that had been lived here. He let her have a moment, then quietly, "Kitchen?" She moved past him without speaking. The kitchen was the back room, a table, a stove, shelves with tin goods, a water basin. The floor was bare wood, swept clean, the boards running parallel to the wall. Lily crossed to the far corner without hesitation, the corner under the shelves, and crouched down and pressed her fingers along the edge of one particular board. The board lifted. Caleb breathed. Underneath was a tin box, maybe 8 inches by 10, the kind sold in any general store. It had a simple latch. Lily pulled it up and set it on the kitchen floor and sat back. Caleb crouched beside her. He opened it. The box had been gone through. He could tell because some of the documents inside were stacked wrong, faced in different directions, a folded letter tucked in upside down relative to the others. Someone had opened this box and looked through its contents and put things back in a hurry. But not everything was gone. Thomas Carter had been a smart man. He'd put things in the obvious place, and he'd also, clearly, been smart enough to know that the obvious place might get found. At the bottom of the box, underneath a folded property survey and 2 receipts for feed, was a false bottom. Not elaborate, just a thin piece of painted wood fitted to look like the box's base. It took Caleb a moment to find the edge of it, and when he lifted it, there was a single envelope underneath, sealed. His name on the outside, not Caleb Stone, not any name, just the man who finds this. If you are not the man meant to find it, put it back. Caleb stared at that for a second. The man who finds this. Thomas Carter had known someone might search the box. He had hidden the thing he valued most under everything else and addressed it to the unknown quantity, the someone who might come along, the maybe that a desperate man holds on to when he's out of certain options. Caleb opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten in the same careful, deliberate script as the deed. 2 pages, both sides. He angled it toward the window to catch the moonlight, and he read. Thomas Carter had not been a man who wrote easily. That was clear from the first line. The sentences were simple and direct, without decoration, the writing of a man who chose words based on whether they said the thing he meant rather than how they sounded. But it was precise. Everything in it was precise. He'd written the letter 6 weeks ago, the same week he'd filed the deed. He'd known, even then, that the situation was becoming dangerous. Hale had sent men to the property twice already, under the pretext of water rights discussions, but Thomas had understood what the discussions were really about. He'd written to a man named Daniel Garrett, a former county surveyor who had measured the original creek boundaries and knew, technically and legally, exactly where Hale's water diversions were and why they were a violation of prior established water rights. Garrett had come to the house. He'd looked at Thomas's evidence. He'd agreed to serve as witness to the deed and had given Thomas something in return, a copy of his original survey, with annotations marking where the diversions had been made and when, based on his own field records. The survey copy was in the envelope. 3 pages, folded. But the letter wasn't finished there. Thomas wrote, I don't know if anything will happen to me. I think Hale is a man who prefers legal means when he can get them. But legal means have not been working in my favor, and I have begun to wonder if that is by accident. I'm writing this because if something does happen to me, I want someone to know what I know. There is a woman in Calhoun County who works in Chester Mead's notary office. Her name is Clara Foss. She witnessed the deed alongside Garrett. She also heard something she was not meant to hear, which she told me about privately after the notarization was done. She told me that 2 days before I came in, a man had been in the office asking Chester Mead whether a property deed in a child's name could be legally set aside if the child had no living guardian and no legal representative. Chester told him it could not without a court challenge. The man left without giving his name. Claire said he was well dressed. She said he wore a signet ring on his right hand that she recognized because she had seen it before, on Victor Hale, when he came to the office 6 months ago to file a different document. She did not say anything at the time because she did not know what it meant. After I told her about the deed and about Lily, she understood. She said she would write down what she had seen and keep a copy of it. I am telling you this so that if something happens, you know where to look. Caleb read the last paragraph twice. Clara Foss, Calhoun County, Chester Mead's notary office, 40 miles north. And Garrett. Caleb looked at the top of the letter for the full name. Daniel Garrett, former county surveyor. Address listed as Millhaven, 8 miles east. 8 miles east. He folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat, next to his chest. He looked at Lily. She had been sitting with her back against the wall while he read, not asking, not pushing. She was watching his face. "Did you find something?" she asked. "Yes." He stood up, holding the box. "Your father was a careful man, Lily, more careful than anybody gave him credit for." Something crossed her face. Not pride exactly, or not just pride. Something more complex. The look of a child hearing something about a parent she loved that she already knew and needed someone else to confirm out loud. "He worried a lot," she said. "He didn't think I could tell." She paused. "Can we take the box?" Caleb looked at it. The box had already been searched. Whoever had been here knew about it. Taking it changed nothing except keeping it out of their hands entirely. "Yes," he said. "We're taking the box." He put the envelope back inside, replaced the false bottom, and closed the latch. He was straightening up when he heard it. A sound from the front of the house, small and specific. The sound of a boot on a porch board. One boot, then a second, more careful than the first. Someone outside had realized, mid-step, that they needed to be quieter. Caleb moved fast and silent to the kitchen door and looked into the main room. Through the front window, he could see the shape of one person on the porch. Through the side window, a second shape moving along the outside wall of the house. 2 of them. Maybe more out back. He looked at Lily. She had heard it too. She was already on her feet, the tin box in her arms, pressed back against the shelving. Her face was white, but her jaw was set. He pointed at the back wall of the kitchen. There was a small door. Not obvious, set flush with the wall, the kind of service door that a man who built his own house added as a practical afterthought. He'd seen it when they came in and filed it away automatically, the way he filed away exits and approaches to any space he was in. He'd been doing that since before he could explain why. She nodded. He crossed to the kitchen table and picked up one of the tin cups on the shelf and set it on the edge of the stove. Balanced wrong, just off-center, where it would fall with a clatter if someone moved past it, in the dark, or if the front door opened with enough force. Then he crossed to the back door, lifted the latch with his thumb, eased it open an inch. Cold air came through. He listened. Nothing immediately outside. He opened it the rest of the way and they went through. They cleared the back of the property at a crouch, using the barn for cover, and then they were moving through the tree line again, Lily managing the tin box without complaint despite its weight and awkward size, moving with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown getting here. Behind them, after about 40 seconds, Caleb heard the tin cup hit the stove, distant, muffled, but there. And then voices, low and urgent, not trying to be quiet anymore. He didn't stop. They moved. They took the long way back, an even longer route than the one out, adding another 40 minutes, but keeping well clear of the road. By the time they reached the back of Mrs. Holt's property, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, and every muscle Caleb owned was telling him about it. Mrs. Holt was waiting in the kitchen. She looked at the tin box and then at Lily and then at Caleb, and she said nothing, which was the exact right thing to do. She put the kettle on instead. Caleb sat at the kitchen table and spread the contents of the envelope out,
While Lily drank tea and ate the biscuits Mrs. Holt put in front of her with the quiet purposefulness of a woman who believed that food was the appropriate response to most crises. He read the survey again, this time more carefully, following the annotations Garrett had made. The creek diversion was marked in red ink, the original boundary line in black, and the gap between them was substantial enough that it wasn't arguable. This wasn't a matter of inches or interpretation. Someone had moved water that didn't belong to them consistently over a period of years, and the man who had originally measured those boundaries had documented exactly what they'd done and when. The problem was that Garrett's survey copy didn't prove who had ordered the diversion. It proved the diversion existed. Testimony would need to do the rest, and testimony needed people willing to give it. He thought about Pruitt, the sheriff who hadn't gone to look at the creek, who kept Carter's written complaint in the third drawer, who was a tired man in a town that belonged to someone else. He thought about Ruth Alderman, who was careful and decent, and whose husband would be back in 10 days. He thought about Baines, who had fed Lily just enough to keep her waiting and who lived every day with the particular weight of that. And he thought about Greer's voice in the alley, smooth and practiced and just barely threatening at the edges. You have no legal standing in the land matter. That was the real problem. Caleb could gather evidence. He could find Garrett. He could make the trip to Calhoun County and talk to Clara Foss. He could build a case that any honest judge would look at and see clearly. But unless Lily had a legal representative, someone with standing, the counterclaim would default. And a default judgment didn't care about evidence that hadn't been formally presented. He needed to file a response, a formal one, before the 2.5-week window closed, which meant he needed a lawyer. He said this out loud to no one in particular, and Mrs. Holt, setting another biscuit on the table without being asked, said, "Jim Reeves, he's in Calhoun County. Honest man. Hale's never gotten to him because Hale's never needed to. Reeves mostly does estate work, wills and such. Nothing that crossed Hale's interests before." Caleb looked up. "You know him?" "My husband used him for our land filing when we came out here 12 years ago. She sat down across from him, wiping her hands on her apron. "If I'm being direct with you, Mr. Stone, and I think this is the moment for it, whatever's in that box, whatever you found out at the Carter place, you need someone with a law license standing beside that little girl before Hale's people find a judge who owes them a favor." She paused. "And I think you need to do it fast because the men who were watching this place last night are going to report back this morning that you went somewhere and Hale is going to start wondering what you found." Caleb looked at her. She held his gaze with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who had thought about this before he'd said any of it. "You've been thinking about this a while," he said. "I've been thinking about that child since the day she sat down on those steps," Mrs. Holt said. "I didn't do what I should have done then. I can do what I should do now." She folded her hands on the table. "I also think you should know that Hale's man, the one in the suit, Greer, he came by here yesterday afternoon while you were out. Asked me very pleasantly how long you were planning to stay." She said pleasantly with a particular inflection. "I told him I didn't keep track of guests' plans, which is true. But I thought you should know." Caleb thought about Greer's pleasantness, the kind of pleasantness that came with an edge you only found if you pushed on it. He looked across the table at Lily, who had eaten 3 biscuits and whose eyelids were heavy despite herself. She was fighting sleep with everything she had left, which wasn't much. "Lily," she looked up, "I need to leave today. Go to Calhoun County. It's 2 days' ride if I push it." He kept his voice level. "I need you to stay here with Mrs. Holt. Keep the box hidden. Don't go outside." She was already shaking her head. "I want to come." "I know." "If you leave—" She stopped, started again. "What if you don't come back?" It was a reasonable question, unreasonably hard to hear from a 7-year-old who had already lost one person who said they'd handle things. "I'm coming back," he said. "That's what Papa said." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on the table, and looked at her directly. "Your father said he'd come back, and he meant it, and something happened that he couldn't control. I can't promise you that the same thing won't happen to me. I won't make you that promise because it's not mine to make." He paused. "What I can tell you is that I'm harder to kill than your father probably was, because I've been trying to get myself killed for 3 years, and I haven't managed it yet."
Mrs. Holt made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Lily looked at him for a long time. Her jaw was doing that thing again, that working motion of a child trying not to show what was happening behind her face. 2 days? She said finally. Maybe 3. 4 at the outside. She looked at the table. She looked at the tin box on the counter. She pressed her lips together. Okay, she said. He left within the hour. He pushed the horse harder than he liked, stopping only to water and breathe him at the creek crossings, eating in the saddle, watching the road behind him with the regularity of a man who has given people reason to follow him. Nobody followed, or nobody he could see, which wasn't quite the same thing, but was enough. He reached Millhaven by mid-afternoon. It was barely a town, more a collection of intentions. A church, a store, a dozen houses, a smithy. He found Daniel Garrett on his second inquiry, at a small house at the east end of the main track. Garrett was 60, maybe older, with the weathered look of a man who had spent most of his working life outdoors reading terrain. He opened the door to Caleb's knock and looked at him with the careful assessment of a man who had learned not to be surprised and was mildly surprised anyway. Caleb told him who he was, and about Lily, and about the tin box and the letter. He didn't tell him everything. He told him enough. Garrett let him inside. The house was orderly, the order of a man who lived alone and had made his peace with it. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which Caleb appreciated. When Caleb finished, Garrett sat with it for a moment. Thomas came to me because he trusted my work, Garrett said. I trusted his claim. The survey doesn't lie. Hale's men moved that water, and they moved it on purpose, and they moved enough of it to eventually kill the spring in that valley. He looked at his hands. I agreed to witness the deed because it was the right thing. I didn't know he'd be dead 5 weeks later. Do you think it was an accident? Garrett looked at him steadily. I think Victor Hale is a man who has never in his life allowed an obstacle to persist if he had means to remove it. He said it carefully. Not an accusation, a characterization. I think Thomas Carter became an obstacle. Will you testify to the survey findings in front of a judge? Garrett was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, weighing. There was a difference. Yes, he said, I'll testify. Caleb reached Calhoun County the following day, late in the afternoon, with his horse leg weary and his back not far behind. He found Chester Meade's notary office closed for the day and took a room at the local boarding house, ate a meal he barely tasted, and spent the evening with Thomas Carter's letter and the survey spread on the bed and his own thinking for company. He found Clara Foss the next morning before the office opened. She was on her way in, carrying a basket, and she stopped when he spoke her name. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, with sharp eyes and the look of a woman who had decided at some point that she was going to pay attention to things and that this was both a gift and an inconvenience. He told her who he was, briefly and without preamble. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, I've been wondering when someone was going to come. Inside the office, with the door closed, she told him what she'd seen. The well-dressed man, the signet ring, the question about whether a deed in a child's name could be set aside. She told him clearly and without embellishment. She had a good memory, and she'd known it was important at the time, which meant she'd kept it intact. Then she reached into the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet and pulled out a sealed envelope. I wrote it down the day after Thomas Carter came in, she said. Dated it. Chester witnessed it without knowing why I wanted him to. She held it out. I've been keeping it in case. Caleb took it. He turned it in his hands. Thomas Carter trusted you, he said. He wrote about you in his letter to whoever might come looking. Something moved across Clara Foss's face, quick and complicated. He was a good man, she said, nervous, trying to do right by his daughter. I could see it all over him. She paused. How is she? Scared, Caleb said. Holding on. How old is she? 7. Clara looked at the envelope in his hands. Then she looked at the window and the street outside, and whatever she was thinking about, she kept to herself. Is there a lawyer in this county? Caleb asked. Honest one? Jim Reeves, she said. He's 3 doors down. Jim Reeves was a man in his 50s with a clay pipe he didn't light.
and the kind of concentrated attention that good lawyers developed over years of listening to people tell them things they needed to hear accurately. He listened to Caleb for 45 minutes without speaking. He read the letter. He examined the survey. He read Clara Foss's sealed statement, which she had come over to deliver in person because she said she wanted to see his face when he read it. When he was done, he set everything down on his desk and looked at the window for a moment. "The default deadline," he said. 16 days, Caleb said. Reeves looked at his pipe. He picked it up and turned it in his fingers. "I'll need to file a formal response to Hale's counterclaim. I'll need to register as Lily Carter's legal representative in this matter, which will require—" He stopped. "Who is her guardian? Legally?" "Nobody," Caleb said. "Not yet." Reeves looked at him over his glasses. "I'm working on that," Caleb said. Reeves was quiet for a moment. "If you file for guardianship in Blackridge County, Hale will oppose it. His people will move fast." "I know." "You're a single man, traveling, no established residence in the county." "I know that too." Reeves turned his pipe once more. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Stone? Forgive the question. I find it useful to understand motivations." Caleb thought about how to answer that honestly. He thought about the steps and the 17 days, and the way Lily had pressed her hand flat against her stomach, and the way Thomas Carter had written the man who finds this on an envelope and trusted the maybe of it because the maybe was all he had. "Because she's 7 years old," he said, "and she's been holding that deed against her skin for 5 weeks, and she hasn't let go of it once." He paused. "That's enough reason." Reeves looked at him for a long moment. Then he set his pipe down on the desk and picked up a pen. "All right," he said. "Let's start at the beginning." Caleb rode back into Blackridge on the 4th day, late afternoon, with the sun coming in low and sideways and turning the dust on the main street the color of rust. He had Jim Reeves's formal response to Hale's counterclaim in his coat pocket, signed and notarized and filed in duplicate. One copy already dispatched by courier to the county seat, one copy for the Blackridge court record. He had Clara Foss's sealed statement. He had Garrett's signed affidavit regarding the survey findings, which Garrett had written out in his precise surveyor's hand, and which said, in language that did not permit interpretation, that Victor Hale's ranch operations had diverted approximately 30% of the creek's natural flow over a period of 4 years, in direct violation of the prior water rights established by Thomas Carter's original claim. He also had, folded separately in his breast pocket, the guardianship petition that Reeves had drafted. Temporary, emergency basis. The kind a court could grant fast if the circumstances warranted it. Reeves had been careful with the language. Careful about Caleb's lack of county residence. Careful about the absence of blood relation. Careful about every weakness Hale's people would find and press on. He'd shored up what he could. The rest would depend on the hearing. The hearing Reeves had already filed to request, scheduled for 9 days from now, in front of a circuit judge named Harold Marsh, who traveled through Blackridge County 4 times a year, and who Reeves said, with the measured tone of a man choosing his words, was not a man who could be easily bought. Whether that meant he was honest or merely expensive, Reeves hadn't specified, and Caleb hadn't asked. 9 days. He tied his horse at the livery and walked to the boarding house without looking at the men across the street. 2 of them. Different men again, but same posture, same studied blankness. He'd stopped counting how many Hale had rotating through, enough to cover the streets and still have others available. That was the arithmetic of a man who was used to having enough. Mrs. Holt opened the back door before he knocked. She looked him over the way a woman looked at a man returning from somewhere difficult, not asking yet, just taking inventory. Alive, upright, carrying something in his coat that mattered. "She's been counting hours," Mrs. Holt said. Lily was at the kitchen table with a cup of something she wasn't drinking, and when he came through the door, she went very still for 1 second, and then something in her face let go. Quietly, controlled, but let go. She didn't run to him. She wasn't that kind of child, or she'd stopped being that kind of child in 17 days on a set of wooden steps. She just looked at him and let out a breath that he suspected she'd been holding for 4 days. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." "I know what you said." He sat down across from her and put the documents on the table. He told her what he'd found, what he'd filed, what was going to happen.
He kept it clear and he didn't talk down to her, because she had already demonstrated that she didn't need to be talked down to. She listened to all of it, with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes on his face. When he finished, she said, "This man Reeves, is he good? He's careful, which is better than good most of the time." She thought about that. "And the judge?" "We don't know yet. That's the honest answer." She nodded slowly. Papa always said honest answers were better even when they were worse. She looked at the table. "He said men who told you what you wanted to hear were usually trying to take something from you." "Your father was right about that." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does Hale do now? When he finds out you filed?" Caleb had been thinking about that for 2 days of writing. "He gets angry," he said, "and then he gets smart. And then he tries to find a way to change what we can do before the hearing." "What ways?" He looked at her across the table. 7 years old, asking tactical questions about a land dispute with the focused interest of a person who understood that the answers affected her directly and permanently. He thought about Thomas Carter writing Lily Margaret Carter on a deed in careful, deliberate letters. He might try to discredit the witnesses, Caleb said. Garrett, Clara Foss. Find something in their histories that makes their testimony look unreliable. He might try to influence the judge before the hearing, though Reeves thinks Marsh is clean. He paused. He might try to move faster, apply pressure on people here in Blackridge to make things difficult before we get to court. On you, Lily said. Possibly. On Mrs. Holt. Caleb glanced at Mrs. Holt, who was at the stove and did not turn around. I'm aware of the risk, Mrs. Holt said to the stove. There's also the guardianship, Caleb said. That's the piece that helps us most and hurts him most. If I have temporary legal guardianship of you, I have standing to formally represent your interest in the land matter. Right now, I'm just a man who rode through town. With guardianship, I become something harder to ignore. Can he stop that? He'll try. Lily looked at the documents on the table. At the top one, the guardianship petition, Reeves's careful language visible even upside down. She looked at it for a long moment. Do you want to? She asked. He looked at her. Do you want to be my guardian? She said. It wasn't exactly a question. It was the kind of thing that sounded like a question, but was really a careful examination of something she needed to understand. Caleb put his hands flat on the table. He thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and the simple answer, which was not accurate, and the true answer, which was somewhere between the two. I want you to have what your father worked for, he said. I want the people who did what they did to him to be held accountable for it, and I want you to stop having to be the only thing standing between yourself and a man with more money than conscience. He paused. As for the guardianship specifically, I'm not going to pretend I know what I'm doing in that regard. I've never been responsible for a child. I'm not a man with a home or a settled life. But I'm here, and I intend to keep being here. He held her gaze. That's the honest answer. Lily looked at him for a long time. Okay, she said. The same word she'd used when he told her he was leaving for 4 days. The same tone. Measured, deliberate, not easy, but decided. He filed the guardianship petition the next morning at the county clerk's office, with Reeves's documents and the notarized affidavits and the counterfiling to Hale's land claim. The clerk, a thin young man who went visibly pale when he read Hale's name on the opposing documents, processed it with shaking hands, but processed it correctly, because that was his job, and he apparently decided, in that moment, that his job was the thing he was going to hold on to. By noon, Victor Hale knew. Caleb was at the dry goods store buying supplies when Greer appeared, not in an alley this time, in the open, in the middle of the street, in front of anyone who happened to be walking by, which meant Hale had decided that the quiet approach was finished. Mr. Stone? Greer was wearing the same coat as before, same boots, same practice pleasantness worn thinner now around the edges. I think we're past the point of pleasant conversation. I thought we were past it in the alley, Caleb said. But here we are again. Greer looked at the packages in Caleb's arms, then at his face. You've filed a guardianship petition. You've filed a response to Mr. Hale's counterclaim. You've been to Calhoun County. He paused on each item like he was reading from a list. That's a significant amount of activity for a man who rode in on a tired horse 6 days ago. I'm a fast mover when I'm motivated. Mr. Hale's position in this matter is entirely sound legally. The counterclaim was properly filed. The default timeline is the default timeline. What you've done is introduce delay, not resolution. What I've done, Caleb said, is make sure a 7-year-old girl gets her day in court. That's all. Greer was quiet for a moment. The pleasantness had finished draining out of him, leaving something cooler and more useful underneath. I want to be direct with you, he said. Mr. Hale understands that you have gathered certain documents, a letter, a survey, a statement from a woman in Calhoun County. He let that sit. The knowledge of it, the implication that Hale's information was as current as this morning. He would like you to understand that documents can be challenged, witnesses can be discredited. The judge assigned to circuit hearings in this county is not unfamiliar with Mr. Hale's standing in the community. I thought Marsh was clean, Caleb said carefully. Something moved in Greer's face. I said nothing about Judge Marsh. No, you said the judge assigned to circuit hearings isn't unfamiliar with Hale's standing. I assumed you meant Marsh because he's the one scheduled for this hearing. Caleb studied him. But you didn't mean Marsh, which means Hale has been working on getting Marsh replaced before the hearing. Greer's face had gone still in the way faces went still when they'd said more than they intended. You should go back to wherever you came from, Greer said. His voice had dropped any remaining pretense of warmth. There is no version of this that ends well for you. There's one, Caleb said, the one where the judge reads the evidence and rules correctly, and a little girl gets to keep what her father legally gave her. He shifted the packages in his arms. I like that version. He walked back to the boarding house. That evening, Pruitt came to see him. The sheriff came in through the back, which was either discretion or caution or both, and he sat down at Mrs. Holt's kitchen table with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who had made a decision that was costing him something. I heard about what you filed, Pruitt said. News travels. Hale's been to see me. Pruitt set his hat on the table. He wants me to challenge your right to petition for guardianship. He wants me to submit a statement to the court saying, you're an unknown transient with no county ties and no documented history in this state. He looked at his hands. He said he'd make it worth my while. Caleb waited. I told him I'd think about it, Pruitt said. And? Pruitt looked up. His eyes had that careful look, the same one from the first morning, but something had shifted behind it. I went back to my files after you left my office the other day, read through Carter's complaint again, the one I should have followed up on. He stopped. I also went and looked at the creek, upstream from Carter's Valley. I looked at what Hale's men did to the water flow. He paused. I looked at it real carefully. Caleb said nothing. I also took a ride out to that ravine, Pruitt said, where they found Thomas Carter. I took a real look this time, not the quick look from 6 weeks ago. His jaw worked. Walt Alderman was right. The ground up there, the marks on the edge, they don't match a man going over on a spooked horse. The kitchen was very quiet. That's a serious thing to say, Caleb said. I know what it is. If you're saying what I think you're saying, and if Hale finds out you're saying it, I know, Pruitt said. He picked up his hat and looked at it and set it back down. I've been wearing this badge for 14 years. 12 of those years, Victor Hale's been in this county. And for 12 years, I've been... He stopped, started again. I've been making it easy for everybody, including him. He looked at Caleb. I've got a record of Carter's complaint, and I've got my own observations from the ravine. That's not nothing. That's significant, Caleb said, if you're willing to put it in writing and stand behind it. I'm willing. Pruitt said it simply, without dramatics, the way a man said something he'd already decided and was finished deciding. I'm also going to go see the circuit court administrator and make clear that any request to reassign the Marsh hearing needs to go through a formal review process before it's approved. He paused. Hale can try, but it'll take longer than 9 days if I raise a proper procedural flag on it. Caleb looked at him. Why are you telling me this tonight? Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Because I came in here 6 days ago through the back door of this woman's kitchen. he said, and there was a 7-year-old girl asleep in the chair with a tin box in her arms. He picked up his hat. And I couldn't go home and look at my wife and tell her I let that go again. He left the way he'd come, through the back. Mrs. Holt, who had been in the adjacent room and had not been asked whether she was listening but had clearly been listening, came and stood in the doorway. "Well," she said. "Well," Caleb agreed. The next 6 days were the kind of days that moved both too fast and too slow, each individual hour dragging and the whole week gone before you'd properly accounted for it. Caleb filed Pruitt's written statement with Reeves, who received it with the controlled expression of a man who had been hoping for exactly this and was being careful not to look like he'd been hoping. Walt Alderman came back from the drive on the 8th day, and his wife told him what had been happening, and he came to the boarding house with the contained fury of a man who had been away while something important occurred and was now intending to make up for that. He was a broad, quiet man, Walt Alderman, the kind of man whose stillness you noticed. He sat down and told Caleb what he'd seen at the ravine in the same measured terms his wife had used, and then he told him something Ruth hadn't mentioned, that Thomas Carter, 2 days before his death, had sent a letter to Walt at the drive camp via a rider who'd come out special. He pulled the letter out of his coat and put it on the table. It was short, 3 paragraphs. Thomas saying he'd made the arrangements, that everything was in order, that if something happened to him, Walt should know the tin box was under the kitchen floor and should make sure someone honest found it. The letter was dated 4 days before Thomas died, 3 days before Hale's men found him at the bottom of a ravine. Caleb read it twice and looked at Walt. He knew something might happen, Walt said. He wasn't panicked about it, but he knew. "Will you testify to receiving this? To what you saw at the ravine?" Walt looked at the letter. "That man came to my table for supper. Burned beans, bad stories, laughed too loud at his own jokes." He folded the letter carefully and put it back in his coat. "Yes, I'll testify." The hearing was set for 2 days away when Baines came to the boarding house. He came in the front door, in daylight, which was either courage or the inability to find the back, and he asked Mrs. Holt if he could speak to Mr. Stone. And when Caleb came down the stairs, Baines was standing in the front room with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who had been rehearsing something and wasn't sure he'd gotten it right. "I fed her," Baines said, "while she was on my steps. I want you to know that." "I know," Caleb said. "I also—" He stopped. His hands worked the brim of his hat. "I also looked away. For 17 days. I let her sit there because Victor Hale told me to let her sit there, and because I've got a store and a mortgage, and I told myself it wasn't my business." He looked at Caleb steadily. "It was my business." "Yes," Caleb said. "It was." Baines absorbed that without flinching. "I want to testify," he said, "about what I saw, about who told me to keep her there and what they said, about the men who came to watch her." He paused. "About the morning a man named Greer came into my store and told me that Thomas Carter had passed and that I should keep the child calm and waiting and not tell her anything until arrangements were made." Caleb went still. "Greer told you Carter was dead?" "The morning after it happened, before any official notification, before anyone else in town knew." Baines held his gaze. "He knew, Mr. Stone. Hale's man knew Thomas Carter was dead the morning after he died." The hearing room in Blackridge's small courthouse held 40 people at capacity and had 53 in it on the morning Judge Harold Marsh took his seat, including half the town who had no direct stake in the proceedings but had apparently decided that watching was the closest thing to doing something that they could manage. Marsh was a compact, white-haired man of about 65 who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned to conserve energy for the things that mattered. He looked at the room, and the room looked back at him. And he read the papers in front of him for 4 full minutes without speaking, while the room held its collective breath. Victor Hale sat at the opposing table with 2 attorneys from the county seat and the particular stillness of a man who was accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him. He was larger than Caleb had expected. Not fat, just substantial, with the physical presence of a man who had grown into his own authority over decades. His face was the face of someone who had been told yes so consistently that he had lost the muscle that processed no. He looked at Caleb once, across the room, when Caleb took his seat beside Reeves. It was the look of a man taking inventory of an obstacle. Caleb looked back at him. Reeves opened with the deed. He presented it clearly, walking Marsh through the filing date, the notarization, the witnesses. He presented the counterclaim and its filing date, same week as the deed, and let the timing speak. He presented Garrett's affidavit on the creek diversion, which Garrett himself followed up in person, testifying for 20 minutes in his careful surveyor's language with the survey map spread on the table, pointing out precisely where the diversion occurred and what it had done to the spring over 4 years. Hale's attorneys challenged Garrett's objectivity. A former employee of the county, they suggested, with a grievance. Garrett said, with the unhurried calm of a man who had spent 40 years being precise, that the survey spoke for itself, and they were welcome to hire another surveyor to dispute it. They had not, apparently, done that. Pruitt testified next. He read his written statement, and then Reeves walked him through the creek and the ravine in Carter's complaint and what Pruitt had done about it, which was nothing, which Pruitt said clearly and without trying to dress it up. He said he had allowed his professional obligations to be compromised by his awareness of Hale's influence in the county. He said this in the same simple, direct terms he'd used in Mrs. Holt's kitchen. Hale's attorneys pushed on him. His relationship with Hale, his salary approval, his record. Pruitt answered each thing honestly, which was, in the end, a harder target than evasion. Then Baines. Baines walked to the front of the room with the air of a man who had made up his mind about something and was going to follow it through, even if his legs were less certain than his resolve. He identified himself. He stated what he had seen and when he had seen it. He stated the visit from Greer, the morning after Thomas Carter's death, and what Greer had told him, and what Greer had instructed him to do. Hale's table went quiet during this testimony, in a way that was different from the quiet before. Greer was in the room, seated behind the attorneys, and Caleb watched his face while Baines spoke and saw something change in it. Not guilt, exactly, because Greer was not a man who carried guilt visibly, but recalibration. The look of a man who had filed something in the wrong drawer and was now watching it come back. Hale's attorneys objected. Hearsay, they said, uncorroborated communication. Reeves asked Baines to repeat the date and the content of the conversation in full, which Baines did, and then Reeves presented Clara Foss's sealed statement, which he read into the record. The well-dressed man, the signet ring, the question about whether a child's deed could be set aside. And he noted that the statement was dated the day after the visit, before Thomas Carter had died, and asked the court to consider the convergence of testimony regarding Hale's prior knowledge and intent. Marsh had been writing steadily throughout. He wrote while the attorneys argued, and he wrote while witnesses spoke, and he wrote when Hale's lead attorney stood and delivered a long and skilled presentation about Victor Hale's 30 years of contribution to the county, his charitable works, his land stewardship, the unverified nature of claims made by a drifter with no county ties against a man of standing. Then the attorney turned to Caleb's past. He had found it, whatever he'd found. Caleb had known this was coming. Greer had as much as telegraphed it in the alley. The attorney told the court that Caleb Stone had abandoned a homestead claim in Wyoming 3 years ago, leaving behind unresolved debts, that he had no permanent address, that he had a history of short-term employment on various ranches with no documented long-term relationships or community ties, that he was, in the precise legal sense, exactly what Greer had called him, a transient with no standing. Then the attorney said that Caleb Stone's wife and daughter had died 3 years ago in a fire, and that following this, Stone had demonstrated a pattern of instability that made him an unsuitable guardian for a vulnerable child. The room went very quiet. Caleb sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at the middle distance and breathed through it. He had known this was coming. He had told Reeves it was coming, and Reeves had said gently that the question was how Caleb responded when it did. Reeves had coached him. He had sat in a notary office in Calhoun County and listened to a lawyer tell him that his worst years were going to be read aloud in a courthouse, and he had said, "Let them." Marsh looked at him. "Mr. Stone, you have heard the characterization. Do you wish to respond?" Caleb stood up. He stood for a moment without speaking, not because he was at a loss, but because he was choosing between the answer that protected him and the answer that was true. He chose the true one.
Yes, he said. I lost my wife and my daughter 3 years ago. I lost our home. And what came after that, the debts and the moving and the not settling anywhere, that's all accurate. He kept his voice even. He didn't look at Hale. He looked at Marsh. I was a man who ran from something I couldn't fix. I know what that looked like from the outside. I know what it cost. He paused.
I also know that I stopped running when I found a little girl who had been sitting on a set of steps for 17 days in a town full of people who had decided she wasn't their problem. And I know that every piece of evidence in this case says she is being deprived of what her father legally gave her by a man who knew what he was doing and did it anyway. He sat down. Hale's attorney tried to recenter. He argued that Caleb's emotional motivations, however sympathetic, did not constitute fitness for guardianship. He argued that a stable home environment required stability the petitioner could not demonstrate. Marsh let him finish. Then Marsh looked at his papers for a long moment. He looked at the room, at Pruitt, at Garrett, at Baines, at Walt Alderman sitting in the witness row, at Mrs. Holt in the public seats, and at Lily, sitting very straight in a chair beside Mrs. Holt, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the judge. Marsh looked at Lily for a moment. Just a moment. Then he looked at the papers and he said, in the measured tone of a man who had been reading evidence for 40 years and had arrived at a conclusion, I'm prepared to rule on both matters. The room didn't breathe. 53 people packed into a courthouse built for 40, and not one of them made a sound when Judge Harold Marsh set down his pen and looked up from his papers. The kind of silence that had weight to it, the kind you felt in your chest, pressing in from all sides, and you didn't realize you'd been holding your breath until the moment it broke. Marsh didn't rush. He had the manner of a man who had learned over decades on the circuit that the quality of a ruling was determined not by how fast you arrived at it, but by how thoroughly you'd earned it. He looked at the room once more, that slow, deliberate survey that took in the witnesses and the attorneys and the people in the public seats who had come because something in them understood that what happened in this room today was going to matter longer than this morning. Then he looked at his papers and he read. The land claim first. He found that Thomas Carter's deed, filed 11 months prior, properly witnessed and notarized, established clear prior right to the valley parcel and spring. He found that Hale's counterclaim, filed 6 weeks prior, failed to establish prior use sufficient to override a legally registered claim. He found that the survey evidence presented by Daniel Garrett, combined with Garrett's testimony, demonstrated active interference with Carter's established water rights over a period of 4 years, interference that was material to the degradation of the spring and that represented, in the court's assessment, deliberate economic pressure against a legally protected land claim. He found that the deed in the name of Lily Margaret Carter was valid, binding, and without legal impediment. He found for the plaintiff. The land was Lily's. The sound that went through the room was not dramatic. It wasn't cheering, wasn't the noise of a crowd in a story. It was more like a collective exhale, like a building settling, like 53 people simultaneously putting down something they'd been carrying without realizing it. Hale's lead attorney was already on his feet, talking about appeals, about the circuit court record, about procedural grounds for review. Marsh let him finish with the patience of a man who had heard this particular speech in various forms for 30 years. Then he said calmly, "Counsel's objections are noted for the record. The ruling stands." Then the guardianship. Marsh set down one set of papers and picked up another. He read through them with the same methodical deliberateness, and the room, which had started to breathe again, went careful and quiet once more. He said, Caleb Stone's petition for temporary guardianship was irregular in several respects. No county residence, no blood relation, no documented history of child rearing. He said the opposing arguments regarding Stone's instability following personal loss were not without merit. He said that the court took the welfare of the child seriously and that no convenience of the moment justified placing a child in an unsuitable situation. Caleb sat with that, kept his hands flat on the table, and didn't let his face do anything. Then Marsh said he had also reviewed the totality of the testimony before him, including the accounts of what Lily Carter had endured over the preceding weeks, including the documented conduct of the opposing party and the opposing party's agents, including the testimony of multiple town residents regarding both the child's circumstances and Mr. Stone's conduct in addressing them. He said that stability was a quality that could be demonstrated in many ways, and that a man who had spent 6 days doing what Stone had done had demonstrated a form of it that the court found relevant. He granted the temporary guardianship. 6 months, subject to review. The conditions were specific. Caleb was required to establish residence in the county within 30 days, required to appear before the court at the end of the 6-month period with documentation of the child's welfare, required to cooperate with a county welfare review at the 3-month mark. 30 days to establish residence. In a county he'd ridden into 9 days ago on a tired horse. He heard Reeves exhale beside him, carefully, quietly, through his nose. He looked across the room to where Lily was sitting. She was looking at him. Her face was doing the thing where it held itself very still while something large moved through it underneath. He couldn't read everything that was in her expression from across the room, but he saw the moment she understood, saw it cross her face and settle, and she didn't look away from him. He nodded at her, small, just once. She nodded back. Victor Hale left the courthouse before Marsh had finished reading the secondary findings into the record. He didn't make a scene. He stood up when his attorneys indicated it was time, and he walked out through the side door with the particular bearing of a man who has lost something and is still in the process of deciding what to do about it. Greer followed him. The 2 county attorneys followed Greer. The door closed. The room breathed again. What happened over the next several hours was not a celebration so much as an unclenching. People who had sat in careful silence during the proceedings began to talk to each other, quietly at first, and then with more volume, the way sound came back into a space after something loud had passed through it. Pruitt shook Caleb's hand, which was a brief and undemonstrative exchange, the handshake of 2 men who didn't need to say much. Garrett packed up his survey maps with the efficiency of someone who had somewhere to be and stopped on the way out to tell Caleb that Thomas Carter had been a good man, and he was glad the thing was settled. Walt Alderman clasped Caleb on the shoulder with enough force to communicate what words weren't covering, and Ruth, beside him, looked at Lily for a moment with an expression that was mostly about Thomas and only partly about anything that was happening now. Baines came up last. He stood in front of Caleb and looked at a point somewhere to the left of Caleb's shoulder, and he said, "I know it doesn't fix what I did. I know that." "No," Caleb said. "It doesn't." Baines nodded, absorbing that. "I'm going to have to live with that." "You are," Caleb said. "Most people do." It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't cruelty. It was just the plain truth about how things worked, which was that actions left marks regardless of subsequent choices, and the best you could do was try to make sure the subsequent choices were better. Baines seemed to understand this. He nodded once more and walked out. Mrs. Holt found them at the edge of the room. She looked at Lily, who was standing close to Caleb's side with the tin box in her arms. She'd insisted on bringing it to the courthouse, which had seemed to Caleb like the kind of thing you didn't argue about. And Mrs. Holt said, with the matter-of-fact warmth of a woman who showed care through practical action, "You're both coming back for dinner. I've had a pot on since this morning because I don't like to be unprepared." Lily looked up at her. "What kind?" "Beef stew, with the good bread." Lily considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Okay." They walked out of the courthouse into an afternoon that had gone warm while they were inside. The kind of October warmth that surprised you, the season making an exception before it committed to what came next. The main street of Blackridge looked the same as it had looked 9 days ago when Caleb rode in. Same storefronts, same dust, same particular quality of light. But something in the air was different. The men who had been watching from across the street were not there. The street felt like a street again rather than a perimeter. Lily walked beside him and didn't say anything for a while. She was looking at things as they passed. The trading post steps, which she gave a long, level look that said more than anything she could have put in words. The dry goods store, the alley beside the smithy where the world had been conducting its business, while she sat 17 days in one spot and held herself together. "Are we staying?" she asked. They were almost back to the boarding house. "I have to," Caleb said. 30 days to establish residence. Court order." "I know what the court order said." She glanced up at him. "I meant after that." He looked at the street ahead of them. He thought about the valley, about a spring and a water source and acreage that was legally hers now, documented and protected, and about the house with its solid porch and its straight corners, and the kitchen floor with the space under it where a tin box had sat until they came for it. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether you want to go back to your father's house." She was quiet for several steps. The tin box shifted in her arms and she adjusted her grip on it. "It's my house," she said. "He built it for us." "I know. It needs work. Nobody's been taking care of it." "I noticed. Can you fix things? Build things?" He thought about this honestly. "I can fix most things. I'm a fair hand at carpentry if it's not too complicated. I'm better with animals and land." He paused. "I burned beans a lot." She almost stopped walking. The not-quite smile appeared and then, for the first time, didn't disappear. It kept going until it was a real one, brief and sudden and completely unguarded. The smile of a child who had just heard something unexpected and funny and let it out before she could stop herself. Then it faded back, and she was walking again, and she said, "Papa burned beans too." "So I heard." She looked at him sideways. "You told me," he said. "The first night, at the restaurant." She nodded, thinking about that. About the restaurant. About the first bowl of stew, and the second bowl of stew. And the fact that she had sat in a warm room with food in front of her, and a person across the table who was not leaving. "Okay," she said. Third time she'd said it, same weight each time. They went back to the house 3 days later when Caleb had satisfied himself that whatever immediate threat Hale's people had represented had, for now, receded. There would be an appeal. Reeves had told him to expect it, had said Hale's attorneys would file within 30 days, and that the appeal process would take months. There would be more hearings, more filings, more of the slow grinding machinery of law that Hale would use to try to drag things out past whatever patience he was betting Caleb didn't have. But the ruling was the ruling. The land was Lily's. The guardianship was in place. Those things could be challenged, but they couldn't be undone without a higher court's order, and Reeves was filing preemptive documentation at every level that would make that harder than Hale expected. The house had been gone through again in their absence. Hale's men, almost certainly, a final attempt to find something useful before the ruling closed off their options. They'd been less careful this time, which told him something about the state of Hale's management as his plan disintegrated. The front room was more disarranged than before, a chair knocked over, a shelf half emptied. Lily walked in and looked at it and said, without particular drama, "They made a mess." They did. She set the tin box on the kitchen table. She stood in the middle of the main room and turned slowly, looking at everything. The knocked-over chair, the shelf, the stove, the window with its view of the yard going to seed outside. Then she righted the chair. She picked it up and put it back where it belonged, straightened it so it sat flush against the table, and moved to the shelf and began replacing the things that had been pushed off it. Caleb watched her for a moment. Then he picked up the broom that had fallen from its hook by the door and started sweeping. They worked for the rest of the afternoon without talking much. There was something in the quality of that silence that was different from the silences before. Those had been the silences of people waiting for something bad, or bracing against something, or carrying something too heavy to speak around. This was the silence of two people doing ordinary work in a space that was starting, again, to belong to someone. Toward evening, when the light was going and the main room was put back to rights, and the kitchen was clean and a fire was going in the stove because the temperature had dropped. When the sun did, Lily sat on the floor in front of the stove with her knees up to her chest. The same position she'd sat in on those steps, but different, because the floor was hers, and the warmth was real, and the door was closed against the cold, rather than left open by someone who wasn't coming back. She said, "He used to sit right there." She indicated the chair nearest the stove. "After supper, he'd read, or he'd look at the fire, or he'd hum." She paused. "Off key." "You mentioned." "I know." She looked at the fire through the grate of the stove. I wanted to say it again, in here, where it happened." She swallowed. "Is that strange?" "No," Caleb said. "That's the opposite of strange." She leaned her head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a while. "I miss him," she said. Not as if it needed saying, as if the saying of it was a way of keeping something real that had a tendency to feel unreal when you were in the middle of trying to survive the aftermath of it. "I know," Caleb said. Do you miss yours? She asked it carefully, without looking at him, giving him room to not answer if he didn't want to. He sat down on the floor on the other side of the stove, his back against the wall, the fire between them throwing light on both sides. Every day, he said. She looked at him across the stove. Is that why you ran? She asked. After? It was the most direct thing she'd ever asked him. He thought about the answer, about the Wyoming homestead, and the debts and the roads and the 3 years of moving, which had looked from the outside like instability and had felt from the inside like the only way he could breathe without the air going sharp. Partly, he said. Partly I ran because staying anywhere felt like pretending that things could be normal again. And nothing felt normal. And I couldn't stand the pretending. And now? He looked at the fire. Now I think maybe normal isn't a thing you go back to. Maybe it's a thing you build again. Different, not the same. He paused. I think I'd forgotten that. I needed something to remind me that building was still an option. Lily looked at him steadily from across the stove. I reminded you? You and your father's letter? And a land deed, and 17 days of watching a town full of people decide it was easier to look away. He met her eyes. But mostly, you. She looked at the fire again. Her chin was doing the thing, the working motion, the thing she did when something was moving through her that she was managing. After a while, she said, Papa would have liked you. Caleb sat with that. It was a generous thing to say, and she said it like she meant it, which made it heavier and more valuable than if it had been easy. I would have liked him, he said, from everything you've told me. He was annoying sometimes, she said. He was stubborn. He didn't like being wrong about things. Most good people are like that. Are you stubborn? Extremely. She almost smiled again. Yeah, she said. I could tell. The state of Victor Hale's affairs deteriorated faster than even Reeves had predicted. The appeal was filed, as expected, but the grounds were weaker than Hale's attorneys had hoped, because Pruitt had submitted additional documentation regarding the circumstances of Thomas Carter's death. Documentation that did not amount to a criminal charge, not yet, but that flagged the matter for the county prosecutor's office in language that was impossible to ignore. The prosecutor was a man named Aldous Finch, not related to Greer, and he had an election coming up in a county that was paying attention in a way it hadn't paid attention before, which concentrated his focus considerably. Greer left Black Ridge in the 3rd week after the ruling. Quietly, without announcement, his office cleared and locked. Whether he left of his own volition or at Hale's instruction was a question nobody answered publicly, though Pruitt had his own views on the matter that he kept between himself and Caleb over coffee at Mrs. Holt's one morning. Hale himself did not leave. He was not, in the end, a man who ran, which was the one quality he and Caleb shared, though they'd arrived at it from opposite directions. He stayed in his house east of the creek, and he let his attorneys manage the appeal, and he waited with the patience of a man who had more resources than the people opposing him, and had always found that patience paid. The appeal was decided 4 months later. The circuit court upheld Marsh's ruling without modification. Caleb heard about it by letter from Reeves on a Tuesday in February, when the snow was 2 feet deep and Lily was in the middle of a disagreement with a fence post that wasn't going into the frozen ground at the angle she wanted. She had decided, sometime in November, that she was going to learn to do everything her father had done to maintain the property, and she had set about this with the organized determination of someone crossing items off a list that only she could fully see. Some things she was naturally good at. Fences were giving her trouble. He came out to where she was and handed her the letter. She read it standing in the snow with her coat on and her breath making small clouds and the fence post forgotten beside her. When she finished, she handed it back and picked up the post and drove it into the ground with a precision that settled it exactly right on the first try. Good, she said. About the letter, not the fence post, though both applied. The criminal investigation into Thomas Carter's death moved slowly, the way these things always moved, through the winter and into the spring. Finch's office interviewed witnesses, examined the ravine again with a more deliberate eye than Pruitt's original review, and compiled a record that grew thicker through the months. 2 of Hale's former ranch hands, having learned that their employer's position was considerably less secure than it had appeared the previous autumn, became available for conversation in ways they had not been before. Caleb did not follow the details of the investigation closely. He followed them enough to know that it was proceeding and that Reeves was monitoring it, and then he focused on the things immediately in front of him, which were considerable. Establishing residence in the county had meant, practically speaking, moving into the Carter house, Thomas's house, Lily's house, which he'd done in the first week, sleeping in the back room that Thomas had apparently used for storage, and which Caleb cleared out and made functional without making much of it. It was not a comfortable arrangement in the way that comfortable was usually understood. The house was cold until he got the gaps in the walls properly addressed. The barn needed work. The fences needed work. The kitchen garden needed to be put to bed properly before winter and then turned and planned for spring. He had not had a piece of land to tend in 3 years. He had not fully realized how much of himself had been stored in the act of maintaining something, in the daily physical accountability of a place that needed you to show up. The work was hard and specific, and it asked him to be present in a way that was, slowly, like learning to breathe differently, not back to what it had been, forward to something else. Lily had strong opinions about the kitchen garden. She had strong opinions about most things, which Caleb found less surprising the more he understood about her father, who had apparently been the same. She wanted tomatoes in the south bed, which was correct because of the sun exposure, and she wanted the bean rows closer to the fence, which was also correct, and she wanted one bed kept for wildflowers, which was not about practicality, but which she explained by saying her father had always kept wildflowers near the porch, because he said the bees needed somewhere to go. Caleb kept the wildflower bed. The 3-month welfare review came in January. A woman from the county welfare office named Greta Simmons drove out in a buggy on a gray Thursday and sat in the main room of the house and asked Lily questions for about an hour, while Caleb was in the kitchen on the explicit understanding that he was not to hover. He made coffee and did not hover. Through the wall, he could hear the murmur of Lily's voice, steady and matter-of-fact, and occasionally Greta Simmons' voice in response. And nothing that was said alarmed him, though he also understood that he was not objective. When Simmons came into the kitchen for coffee, she looked at him with the assessing look of a professional who had been doing this long enough to see past the surface of most things. "She's a remarkable child," Simmons said. "Yes," Caleb said. "She's been through a great deal." "She has. She talks about her father a lot, clearly and specifically. She doesn't avoid it. She has good instincts," Caleb said, "about what to hold and what to let move." Simmons looked at him over her coffee. "She says you burned the beans." Caleb paused. "That's accurate." "She says her father burned the beans too." Simmons' expression shifted. Not unprofessional, but human. The kind of human that came through in good welfare workers who remembered that they were dealing with people and not cases. She said it like it was a good thing. "I think it was," Caleb said. Simmons filed her report. Caleb read it when Reeves forwarded the copy. It was careful and thorough, and it concluded in the precise language of professional welfare assessment that the child was in a stable, supportive, and appropriate placement, and that continuation of the guardianship arrangement was recommended. He put the report in the tin box, next to Thomas's letter, next to the deed, next to the survey, and Clara Foss's sealed statement. The tin box had become a kind of record, not just of the legal history, but of the whole thing, everything that had happened from the moment a man in a trail-worn coat had crouched down in front of a child on a set of steps and offered her the last piece of jerky in his saddlebag. The 6-month review was in April, when the valley was doing what Lily's father had described, and what Lily had repeated on their first night. The morning light coming through the trees, the spring running full and clear, the particular gold that the early light made of everything when it hit the water at the right angle. Caleb and Lily rode to Calhoun County together for the hearing. It was a 4-hour ride, and Lily talked for most of it, which was still something that surprised him occasionally. The contrast between the child who had sat 17 days in total self-contained silence and the child who, given security and enough food and a person who wasn't going anywhere, turned out to have a great deal to say about most things. She had opinions about the horses they passed on other properties, opinions about the quality of the road repairs the county had done or not done, opinions about the book she was reading, which she had read 40 pages of the previous evening and which had made her angry in a specific way that she wanted to fully explain. He listened. He offered observations where he had them. He disagreed with her about the book, which produced a spirited argument that lasted until they reached Calhoun County and was not fully resolved even then. Marsh was on a different circuit that month. The hearing was before a judge named Clara Wells, who was on Marsh's court and who had read the full record. She asked questions for 30 minutes and reviewed the welfare report and the documentation and then approved the permanent guardianship. Not temporary, permanent. Caleb sat in that courtroom and looked at the word on the official paper, permanent, and felt something in him that he hadn't expected and couldn't entirely account for. Not relief, though it was that. Not satisfaction, though it was that too. Something more like the feeling of a thing settling into its right place after a long time of being wrong, and the particular stillness that came after. On the ride home, Lily was quieter than the morning. Not sad quiet, thinking quiet, the kind she got when something was turning over in her head. He let her have it. They were an hour out from the valley when she said, "What does it mean? Permanent?" "It means what it says. It's not subject to review anymore. It's done." She looked at the road ahead. "So you're my guardian?" "Yes." "Like a father." He thought about how to answer that, about Thomas Carter writing off-key hums and burned beans and wildflowers for the bees, and about what it meant to try to be something in the vicinity of what that had been without pretending to be the same thing. "Like someone who's going to be there," he said, "however you need me to be." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a careful answer." "It's an honest one." She nodded slowly. She looked at the road, at the hills opening out ahead of them toward the valley. "Papa would have said something like that," she said. "He was careful with words, too. He said you shouldn't promise more than you knew you could keep." "Smart man." "Yeah." She looked at the spring through the trees as they came around the last bend, the afternoon light on it, doing what it always did. "I think he'd be glad," she said. "About all of it." She paused. "About you." Caleb looked at the valley, at the house with its solid porch and its straight corners, at the barn that stood upright now instead of listing, at the kitchen garden laid out in its winter rows waiting for spring, at the fence that Lily had gotten precisely right on a Tuesday in February in 2 feet of snow. He thought about Thomas Carter writing a letter to a man he'd never met and addressing it to whoever finds this, and trusting that the world might produce someone worth trusting. He thought about the fact that the world had. He thought about a road going north or south or east or west, and what it had meant for 3 years and what it meant now, which was nothing, which was a road, which was something you could take or not take based on whether you had somewhere better to be. He had somewhere better to be. "I think he would have been glad too," Caleb said. He meant it, and he didn't dress it up, and he didn't say anything more after it, because it was enough. They rode down into the valley as the light turned gold across the spring, and the water ran clear over the stones that Thomas Carter had measured and recorded and put his daughter's name on, and the house that a man had built right because he did things right was waiting for them at the bottom of the slope with the lamp already burning in the window, because Caleb had left it that morning, a habit he'd picked up sometime in November without noticing, lighting the lamp before he went out so there was something to come back to. It occurred to him as they came down the slope in the late afternoon light that this was what it looked like when a man stopped running. Not dramatic, not a grand arrival, just a lamp in a window and a child riding beside you and the ground under your feet that wasn't shifting for once, that was solid, that was yours to tend if you took care of it. He took care of it. Not perfectly. He still burned the beans, still said the wrong thing sometimes, still woke at 3 a.m. occasionally with the weight of what he'd lost sitting on his chest, and had to breathe through it the old way until the new way came back. He was not a man rebuilt into something better than what he'd been before. He was just a man trying to do right by a child who deserved it, on land that a good man had died protecting, in a valley where the spring ran clear because enough people had finally decided that looking away was something they couldn't keep doing. Some things you don't come back from, but some things you come through. And coming through is its own kind of arrival. Rougher than you planned, slower than you hoped, nothing like the stories where everything resolves clean and nobody burns the beans and the man arrives already knowing what he's doing. But real, which is the thing that matters most in the end. Not perfect. Real. The lamp burned in the window. They rode home.